Okay, so you're interested in sports photography. Well, you definitely picked probably the most expensive genre of sports photography, but that doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. So let's talk about what kind of cameras you should be looking at. If you're someone who's already into photography, your camera gears that you have right now might be just perfectly fine. It just really depends on what your budget is, how important the sports photography is to you, the lighting conditions, and then really where you want to go with it. Do you see yourself going? Is this going to be something where, hey, I'm just taking pictures for my kids? Is this something you want to be like a side gig, or hey, you're going to go all in and make this your business? A few cameras here. I'm a Nikon shooter. I am not on a certain brand. I just happen to shoot a Nikon a lot. There's nothing wrong with Canon or Sony or the other brands, but it's just what I have here. There's definitely similar cameras in other brands as well. This is my old Nikon D700. It's a DSLR. And this is my Z8 that I have. It's a mirrorless camera. Now, for those who aren't familiar, the basic difference between these two cameras, they're both digital cameras, is that this is more like the old school film camera. So there's actually a mirror box that takes the image that comes into the lens and brings that to the viewfinder, whereas with this, it's taking an actual live feed directly from the sensor into your viewfinder. So basically here, it's like looking through, on some level, like a telescope. With this, it's kind of like looking basically at your phone screen. It's the same kind of thing. If you have one of these, or you think about considering one of these, that's perfectly fine for sports photography. I've done plenty of sports photography on that. There's a lot of photojournalists out there still using this. But the thing to keep in mind, this is the current technology. This is where all the manufacturers are going. Nikon just recently announced that their D6 was the top pro level sports camera that they had for DSLR is discontinued. Canon has stated repeatedly in the last year or so that it's end of life for their DSLRs. They're not going to do any future development. And Sony hasn't done DSLR since they switched to mirrorless several years ago when they originally bought out Pentax, I think. So either cameras are fine. It's just a matter of what your budget is. I would recommend mirrorless personally, I think in the long term, just because there are certain advantages that I like with sports photography that do help. So some things to think about when it comes to cameras itself, when it comes about specifically about sports photography. You think about action. So I know a lot of people think, oh, frame rate, advance rate, how many frames a second I can shoot. And that is definitely important, but it's not as important as you might think. This camera is a D700. This is from 2007, so it's literally 15-year-old technology. And it shoots with this grip on there at 8 frames a second. And I think that's actually fine for sports. You can do it. What a higher frame rate like this camera, they can shoot at 20 frames per second RAW or even 120 frames per second JPEG. It just gives you more options. But if you don't know what you're doing or you don't have a workflow, all it just means is more photos to sort through. So that's not something I would necessarily say, oh, that absolutely has to be your end-all be-all. Pretty much any upper-end camera, whether it's a DSLR or mirrorless, is going to have a frame rate that's sufficient. What you're really looking for is the things that matter, like autofocus. All the cameras are going to have really good autofocus. Like Nikon just had their new processor called X-Speed 7, which came out in the Z9, which I have, and they start trickling down that technology. So even the more basic cameras have very, very good autofocus. The advantage of the more expensive cameras is you're going to have even faster processing speed, so the focus will be even faster. And typically, because you have bigger batteries like this, that also means that the autofocus motors will run faster, which means just better tracking of objects. So the other thing you want to think about, honestly, is probably durability and weather sealing. The higher end models are going to have better weather sealing, and that's going to be a benefit if you're going to be shooting in inclement weather. Say, as far as features for mirrorless you want to look for is, like I said, the subject tracking. Almost every mirrorless camera these days will have some version of subject detection, so it'll detect a human being, and then it can detect the eye, which is really great. The advantage of that versus, say, the older cameras that don't have that is that you can focus on composition and not worry about getting the focus as your main priority. With this camera, I basically had to worry about getting my subject on the focus sensors, getting it in focus, and everything else came secondary. And that's not bad. Typically what a lot of sports photographers would do back in the day, and you still do now, is you take the picture, make sure it's sharp, and then you'll crop to the right kind of composition that you want. Whereas with mirrorless, because you can track your subject no matter where it is in your viewfinder, you can really start actually composing as you're shooting. And that is an advantage. Well, another thing you want to think about if you want to consider is with the higher end cameras like my Z9, will have an integrated vertical grip, which this is an actually add-on. Now, the thing with a vertical grip, it does add size and weight to the camera. In this case, it actually adds more weight and size than it would if it was integrated. This camera actually is bigger than my Z9 overall because it's added on grip versus being integrated. It's a personal choice. I personally recommend having a vertical grip. The reason why I like doing it is I like to shoot actually in the portrait mode a lot. I think a lot of sports are amenable to that kind of orientation, particularly like say soccer, for example, or baseball. The people are typically standing up, and I find it much more comfortable to have my hand like this versus having to shoot like this all the time. Most grips will have a duplication of control, so in addition just to handhold and the autofocus button or shutter button, you're going to also have various controls to duplicate it as well. Also, if you're shooting with the bigger sports lenses, this will balance the camera out better because a lot of those lenses are pretty heavy, and by having a little more counterweight on the back end, it makes it a little bit easier to handhold. And it's something I would also consider. I know a lot of people are used to shooting in the landscape format because that's what we do most of the time, and we only think of this when taking pictures of people individually. Start trying that for sports too. In addition to sometimes compositionally giving you a different kind of look, it also actually gives you a little more flexibility with your telephoto zoom, because by being like in the vertical position and a player is running towards you, you have more time to take photos before you start cropping off the legs or the head. Okay, so if we're talking about mirrorless versus DSLR, what are the advantages of mirrorless? And that's an interesting question because I think everybody can have their own take on it. I think the biggest thing I would say just in general long term is just the fact that the manufacturers are currently, it's current technology and they're currently supporting it. One of the reasons why I ended up upgrading from my D700 is that Nikon no longer services this camera. It's too old. I could have gotten a newer DSLR camera, and I was almost considering that, but at the time I was about to buy a new camera, Nikon came out with the Z9, and that's what I ended up going with instead. And I've switched all my lenses over to that as well. So some of the advantages you're going to find for sports photography for mirrorless, like I said before, is autofocus. You're going to have the subject tracking. It can detect things in real time. You can worry less about where your subject is in the frame and more worry about composition and getting exposure right. And that's the other thing too with exposure is that with a mirrorless camera, because you're getting a live feed from the sensor, you're actually seeing in real time what your exposure settings are doing to the actual image. There's an old phrase come back from the DSLR days called chimping, which probably maybe some of you guys don't know, but the reason why we used to say that is you take a picture and immediately you see everybody on the field, as soon as you take a picture, they pull the camera away and look at the back of their screen like little monkeys looking at their screen. That's something you don't have to do anymore because you already know what the image looks like as you're going in real time. Another advantage too is because it is a digital screen in the background, you can put as much information on that background, on that screen as you want. So you can have your exposure information, you can have a level if you want, you know where your subject tracking is. So those are some of the things that I feel are a huge advantage and I would recommend for sports. But once again, there's nothing wrong with this. And I can tell you right now, the advantages in terms of price, a camera like this with this kind of equivalent lens, you're talking about brand new, I don't know, between the lens and the body, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000. You can buy a used DSLR probably as low as under $1,000, and the lens for also that. So it definitely has some savings to be had. In terms of image quality, there are huge advances to some extent with the sensors and image quality in terms of low light capability, but overall there really isn't that much difference you're going to see, especially if you're taking sports photos in daylight. When I switched from this camera to my Z9, the clients didn't come up to me and say, "Wow, did you change cameras?" No one noticed the difference. So the reality is, for a lot of the things you're going to do, image quality should be the least of your priorities when debating between a DSLR and mirrorless. It's really going to come down to all the other intangibles like autofocus. And that's another thing too, as far as autofocus. You will find that autofocus is typically more accurate on mirrorless consistently, and part of that is how the systems work. So with the DSLR, because you have the mirror box in the way of the sensor, you actually have a separate focusing system in the camera. And so what you have to do a lot of times, and people will know this for both DSLRs, you have what's called autofocus fine-tune, because it isn't exactly the sensor itself, there is a little bit of wiggle room between what is actually in focus on the autofocus sensor and the actual lens itself. And you would tune, a lot of times, the autofocus system in your camera to each specific lens. Whereas with the mirrorless camera, since the autofocus sensors are directly on the sensor, there is no need to do micro adjustments. So Not only does the mirrorless camera itself typically focus a lot more consistently in focus, if you have DSLR lenses that you're adapting to your mirrorless camera, they will perform actually even better. So a lot of people have found, and I found this when I first switched, I used adapted lenses, that my old lenses were sharper on my mirrorless camera than were on my DSLR because of that advantage. I would say overall, if you're going to choose between mirrorless and a DSLR, it really comes down to budget. If you can afford it, I would say go with the mirrorless. You're going to take advantage of the newer technologies. You're going to have more current support. There's more of the newer lenses. The advantage of the newer lenses, not only are they sharper generally than the older lenses, not that the sharpness difference necessarily is that big a difference where, hey, it's going to impact the quality of your images, but it just is sharper. But also there's a lot of technology in terms of weight savings. My 400mm lens that I have currently weighs 6.5 pounds. The previous generation version of that for the DSLR weighs 2 pounds more than that, and the one before that weighs almost another 2 pounds more. So you tend to sometimes get some weight savings and much better image quality with the lenses, and you're getting the current technology. In terms of what brand to pick, I really don't think you really need to try each camera, whether it's Sony, Canon, or Nikon, and see which one fits your hands the best and what menu systems you like. Everybody's personal about how they like where controls are laid out. It's almost like cars. It's not just about brand name, but some people just like the way controls feel in certain brands. It's the same thing with cameras. I think you need to try them out first and then go with that and invest in that system, because once you're not just buying the camera, you're buying the lenses and everything else that goes with it. People might follow, like, whoa, do I get a full frame camera or a crop sensor? So Nikon, Canon, and Sony do make a full frame cameras, which is the majority of what people use for sports, and they use crop sensors. A crop sensor, what that means is just a smaller sensor. And what it does is that it allows the camera itself to be smaller. It ends up being cheaper because the sensors themselves do contribute a huge cost to the camera. So the smaller the sensor, also the less the camera is going to cost. But it does technically increase effective focal length. So if you're trying to get to 400mm and you're buying a full frame camera, the only way to do that is to buy a 400mm full prime lens or a zoom lens that goes out to that. If you have something like a crop sensor, so for Nikon, it'd be like their Z50. I think for Canon, it might be like the R8. I'm not 100% positive on that. You can take a 300mm lens, and that effectively will be a 420mm lens. So there's an advantage there. If you're trying to get extra reach and you don't have the budget, a crop sensor can do that. Now, there's no free lunch. With a crop sensor camera, because of a smaller sensor, you're going to have some issues with low light situations where it's not going to be quite as good as a full frame sensor. Even with the noise reduction software is out there, you'll still see a difference depending on what you're doing. And there's also more increased depth of field, which is something I can get into later. But one of the things you're going to find out with sports photography is that most of us are not going to be shooting at a pro stadium where the background's perfect. You're probably going to shoot at a background where there's going to be parents sitting in their chairs, there's porta potties in the background, and you want to blur that out as much as possible. So by shooting a full frame camera, when you're shooting wide open at aperture f2.8, a full frame camera is going to throw that background more out of focus than a crop sensor. That's why if you look at your cell phone, almost everything's in focus because it's such a tiny sensor. That's why they have to have like a filter function that kind of mimics the blur that you see in a full-size camera. But that said, I don't have a problem with someone using a crop sensor. The other alternative is M4 cameras, which is Panasonic and Olympus or OM systems. That's what they call 2x crop. So the advantage there is that a 200mm lens on a full frame camera acts like a 400 on that. And on top of that, the cameras are smaller. So if size and weight is your bigger priority, you care about that more than having the best low light capability in all conditions and you don't need it, then that's something worth looking at. For me, the full frame is where it's at for me. I don't mind the weight. I'm willing to pay the weight penalty to have the maximum, not just optical quality, but the optimal depth of field when I need to for subject separation, and I need the low light capability because I shoot a lot of games at night.